Hello folk, how you doing? Scotty. So I like to argue on the whole thing to do with individualism and collectivism. However, these two terms are grossly misinterpreted and they clearly haven't studied into individualism to understand why their arguments are, deeply inherently flawed.
What do you think of when you hear the word collectivist? Bees? Ants? The Borg? Sure, all reasonable. You probably also think of classic communist states like the Soviet Union or China, but I'm willing to bet that you don't think of capitalism. Unless, that is, you've read my very persuasive essay in Current Affairs called Capitalism is Collectivist.
And this is exactly what I mean about these sort of people that really don't understand the whole thing today with, collectivism or individualism. When you hear about individualism, people just think to themselves, oh, greed. Or they think to themselves, oh, well, it's every man for himself. And how often have you heard that when it comes to the argument on capitalism? It's just a case that their interpretation of individualism is that it's just all about greed and every man for himself, therefore, just self-interest. Even taking the term self-interest and basically misinterpreting that. When it comes to individualism, it just simply means that the primary element of the economy is the individual, and that the individual is economically independent and free and personally responsible for their own finances, etc., etc. It just simply means that the primary element of the economy is the individual and they're free to choose. It simply means that the individual is free to choose to go and work for somebody else, and they might work together collectively, or it simply means that the individual has the freedom to go and start up their own private business, and therefore things are not as simple and black and white as this whole issue, as if to say individualism just means that every man for himself and therefore there's no collective action taking place within the economy. It just isn't the case. Under individualism, relative to what we're speaking about, basically what defines a free market economy, you basically see collective action. You see that with, people working together in companies, or certain companies working with other companies by their own free choice. And each one of those companies where they're working together collectively, the individual or individuals that make up the collective groups or whatever, they have the freedom as individuals to choose to go and do whatever the hell they like. They can choose to work together collectively, they can choose to go and work by themselves. That's the beauty of individualism. This is why it's so important to understand this interpretation of individualism, because it's not as black and white as what they're trying to make it to be. Collectivism strips that entire liberty away for you. That's the very reason why under full-blown collectivist regimes, you've never seen the liberty that these so-called libertarian socialists purport to be. Collectivism in the real world, and again this is the fine difference between theory and practice. Theory, they can argue all they want and just tell you that socialism will somehow have the freedom of individuals. It's just that isn't the case. In the real world, the state becomes the main element of the economy, like you've seen in every collectivist regime. Doesn't matter whether you talk about Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, North Korea, and all of these collectivist regimes, what they all have in common is that the state becomes the main element of the economy, and the purpose of the people collectively is to serve the state. In the real world, again, how you pay for these public services through the tax. Well, who is it that taxes the people? It's the government. The government, therefore, is the one that controls the money. It's the one that controls where the money goes. It's the one that controls pretty much everything, especially when it comes to public ownership. And that's the true face of collectivism. It strips. And if you're talking about full-blown collectivism, you're essentially taking away the individual's rights and liberty. And it basically means you're subordinating individuals' rights. So with Current Affairs, how can they say that capitalism is inherently collectivist when capitalism is about individual private property rights? It's about individual rights, it's about that of the free market. It's got nothing at all to do with collectivism. It's an antonym to collectivism. And you can even find that in various sources, and I've pointed this out numerous times before. In numerous sources, you will find that capitalism is listed as antinomous to that of collectivism, and for very good reason. Antonym basically means something that's opposite to the meaning of another word, whereas a synonym for something means that it's relatively close, very close, or the same meaning as that of another word. So why is it that every single source that you'll find, socialism is listed as a synonym to collectivism, but you'll find capitalism is antinomous to that of collectivism? That's because capitalism's got nothing at all to do with collectivism. You see, the very reason why people like this are very sly, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to, pull capitalism outside individualism, and they're trying to pin capitalism off as something collectivist. And the reason why they're trying to do this is because then they can say, well, here's Nazi Germany, there's an example of what capitalism was. Rubbish. Essentially, capitalism is an individualist system, therefore you cannot pin the likes of fascism and that of Nazism off onto capitalism. This is the very reason why they try to do it. They're trying to blur the lines in order to try and pin the blame off onto capitalism for what you saw in Nazi Germany. And I'm not daft, I can see right through them. And if they're basically saying that capitalism's got something to do with collectivism, they're essentially calling capitalism something inherently socialist. Because like I said, in every source that you could possibly find, you'll find that collectivism, even by definition, strongly correlates to that of socialism. You'll find that in every source with collectivism. You can even find that in the dictionary definition of what a collectivist is, and you will see socialist linked to that, and for good reason.
Capitalism, after all, is individualist, right? Which is the opposite of collectivist. Well, that's wrong. When you think of collectivism, you should also think of capitalism, and here's why. At its most basic, collectivist means a situation in which the individual subsumes his or her will to that of the group. Everyone must sacrifice their own personal well-being or willpower or agency or whatever to the well-being of the group, of the collective. They hand over their decision-making process to the group's decision-making process.
Again, when you're talking about individualism and you have that of, let's just say, an individual that chooses and contractually agrees to work for another company or whatever, it's still down to that individual's free choice of what they choose to do and go and work for a company. And therefore, yes, in that circumstance, they would then have to subordinate certain rights to that of the collective or whatever when working for a certain company. But the individual, as we know, still has that free choice, what they choose to do with their own economic life, their finances, etc. They still have the freedom to choose to even, go and start their own private business or choose to leave the company. And that is not the true face of what collectivism is all about.
Or to the leader designated as representing the group. The definition of individualist, meanwhile, at its most basic means doing whatever the hell you want, whenever you want, without regard to the social group you may be a part of and whatever they want. These are, of course, extreme situations, two poles on a big spectrum of collectivist to individualist. Most times there's a mix of both of these things happening. There's a push and a pull between the collective will and the individual will. There's a negotiation between the well-being of the group and the well-being of the individuals that constitute the group. It all depends on what kind of group you're in, the kind of mood you're in, the ideology of the country you inhabit or the community you inhabit. The classic view of capitalism as individualist and communism as collectivist is at least as old as Marx. But the more recent hardline division between the two can be traced to Friedrich von Hayek, intellectual father of the neoliberal consensus. In his book, The Road to Serfdom, which is a terrible book, Robert, he tried to suggest that the New Deal welfare program and the British welfare state were collectivist.
Now this whole thing to do with this welfare state, etc. A big part of what defines socialism is political centralisation, state direction of the economy, etc. A defining ethic of socialism is coercion. Now this is something that I personally point out for why the welfare state is inherently socialist. In fact, the socialists themselves, admitted that with regards to the welfare state, it was a useful tool, a stepping stone towards their end goal for socialism, etc. Of course, creating a dependent class, etc., etc. It's a whole other story. The state force people collectively, they subordinate their rights, they collectively force society to collectively pay into this one pot for the sake of this welfare state. That defining ethic, again, that's to do with socialism, this whole thing of coercion, forcing individuals into a collective group and forcing society to collectively pay for others, to basically pay for a welfare state. Capitalism's about the voluntary exchange. Therefore, capitalism's all about charitable operations. So in other words, when you talk about capitalism, you're talking about things like that of the food banks as a good example. Again, I don't understand for the life of me why people would oppose the food banks and think they're so awful, but you never hear them complaining about things to do with the welfare state, which is laughable to say the least. You've got the government forcing people collectively to pay into one system that is inherently socialist within this mixed economy today. So yes, the welfare state to a varying extent is inherently collectivist to that level, and it is inherently socialist. So socialism, this is why it's inherently flawed. Even for the moral perspective, the moral argument against socialism is deeply flawed because it's immoral. There's nothing moral about trying to force people to pay for others. If you want to help folk, it's done through voluntary action. That's the difference between capitalism and socialism.
He argued that these very mild social programs would put the world, the Anglophone world at least, on the road to serfdom. He even compared these basic social safety nets with Nazism and Soviet collectivism. The only thing, he argued, that could save people from the dreaded free healthcare of the British National Health Service, or the nightmarish benefits of Social Security.
I was born and brought up here in Scotland, and to make it very clear, the NHS here in Scotland is a devolved issue. Now, what that simply means is the fact that it used to be just a case where it was just the British NHS. It was universal across the whole system. And the reason why I point this out is because the fact that the NHS in Scotland soon became devolved. That means the Scottish Government is fully responsible for the whole thing to do with the NHS in Scotland. And the reason why that's important is because if you look at the UK population as a whole, which is about 65 to about 70 odd million people, in terms of the population size, of course it's grown over years. And you compare that to a country like my own, Scotland, we only have 5 million people living here in Scotland. Even with the NHS as a devolved issue, it's struggling. It can't cope with 5 million people. So if the NHS can't cope with 5 million people, what the bloody hell does this guy think? Does he honestly think that 300 million people in the United States of America is going to cope with something like a universal healthcare system like the NHS? He's having a laugh. You know, this was even pointed out by Christian Yemyets. He even mentioned how all the hospitals in the Netherlands, as a good example, are all privately owned. And then, of course, there was the mention about Sweden, a country where they brought in all the private initiatives, etc., etc. All these systems that you see across Europe, they all have some level of private initiatives that have all been brought in, so it's never the black and white picture that the political left try to make out and say, well, you know, this full-blown universal healthcare, etc. And again, I could go off in a whole other argument. I've been through the arguments. You can check out my videos where I've even, you know, mentioned about the main American healthcare market costs. I've even, you know, made a video where you can check it on direct primary care, and you can see the, you know, strong difference between what's more of a free market model to that of something that's strongly, you know, government interventionist. And you can see a colossal difference between the two of them. Universal healthcare, as if that, you know, it's a problem that people like me have got against it. Well, aye, it is a problem. It's a problem because ever since the 1950s, it's been a disastrous failure. The NHS hasn't worked a single year in its entire history. If you're going to take information for people who support the NHS, they're just going to be biased. And they're going to be biased to cover up the truth. And the truth is that every single year that's passed by in the presence of the NHS and people who have got enough information, enough knowledge, enough statistics to even back it up with, you know, the failure on cancer treatment, the failure on heart disease treatment, the failure on, you know, countless things across the board when it comes to the NHS. Its incompetence is unbelievable. It's like a lottery almost when it comes to the NHS. It's your luck, honestly, because some people end up lucky and other people are left in neglect. And that's just the true face of it. And you can't cope with that because the reality is it's not got a price structure, there's no profits and losses, therefore you can't ration scarcity. Now this is why people say that just because you call it free, it doesn't mean you can magically, wish away the economic reality of scarcity. And you certainly see that with the NHS, because decade after decade after decade, from the 1950s right to that of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, article after article, you can see for yourself that it was faced with long waiting lines, staff shortages, it's faced the hospital bed shortages and all sorts. That's the reality. It's existed since then. Even in articles from 1995, there was the hospital bed shortage problems, etc. Again, every decade, the same excuses would come around, and it's been the same thing ever since. It just so happened to be the private finance initiatives came in, and I think it was around about 2000, under the Labour Party. They're now trying to use that as an excuse, and they're trying to say that the NHS was fine before the private finance initiatives, as if to say, oh well, it was all the fault of the private finance initiatives that the NHS is a failure. No, it's because of government's involvement in healthcare. You cannot operate anything efficiently if you're running something free at the point of use, because you've not got a sound price structure. In other words, you don't have a price signal and price fluctuation. And if you don't have price fluctuation, you've not got the information of profits and losses in order to operate anything efficiently. So you're going to be faced resource misallocation. You're going to be faced with the shortage problems, because the free at the point of use is acting almost pretty much like the way that of a price ceiling is. The same problems occur, because you're faced with the massive big long waiting lines, you're faced with the shortages, etc. And that's just part and parcel of economic reality. I've also got to add in the very fact that Hayek was right in what he was saying. He was saying that these things were a platform. In other words, to create that dependent class. That's more or less what he was saying. And as for his comment about social security, that's laughable. The biggest, in fact, I wouldn't even go as far as to call it a contribution, because just like what, the great Milton Friedman had once said, he stated himself that a contribution denotes voluntarism, and of course that's not something you can say with regards to taxation. The biggest factor, I would say, I wouldn't call it a contributing factor, but the biggest factor behind the soaring debt level, whether you talk about the United States of America or the United Kingdom, is down to the social security. The real debt level in the likes of the United States is probably more than 220 odd to 230 odd trillion dollars. And in the United Kingdom, our debt level is probably more than 10 trillion by now. There's the unfortunate reality that the unpaid pensions makes up most of it. So there's a lot of things to go into it with regards to the debt, and it just so happens to be that a biggest factor behind the UK's debt and the United States is all the unpaid pensions, etc., all to do with the social security, as well, of course, the liabilities from bailing out the banks. Again, that's the fault of socialism. Of course, that doesn't sit down too well with folk. The social security was never something you could afford, and it's all well, clinging on for your feelings and saying, oh well, we need it. Well, economics doesn't care what you claim that you need. Economics doesn't have feelings. It doesn't care for you. It doesn't, it doesn't care what you want. You might want something. Economic reality will slap you hard right across the face, and it's already doing so. You can already see that for the economic reality, that your inflation is getting out of control, your debt's getting out of control, and the economy is not sustainable. Trying to finance an economy through spending what you don't have. That's why your inflation's getting worse, because they're borrowing and spending more that you can't afford. And eventually that's all going to come to an end, a crashing end. They've been paying for the social security through borrowing. If that's not something that you can understand, God help you.
Horrors like the elderly not dying in poverty was a harsh social Darwinian liberal capitalism. For Hayek, the collectivism spectre was a tool for scaring people away from caring about the common good. This tactic was essentially meant to prevent solidarity by pitting people against each other and giving psychopathic people and corporations the moral justification for continuing to be psychopaths.
You cannot conflate competition, which is something healthy, and just because there's competition in the economy, it doesn't mean to say that it's every man for himself again. There's benefits to it. In fact, it was the competition that prohibited the likes of monopolies and oligopolies and the cartelization from forming, etc. And again, the freedom of the market, so that there's no barrier to entry into the market that allowed that, to take place. Rising standards of living, etc. throughout the Industrial Revolution, the productivity, that was all thanks to competition. And again, even the competitive skilled labour market that led to the rise in wages. How on earth can he pass that off as something psychopathic? I've got no idea. This is just the usual irrational argument, as if to say competition's a negative thing. If you were to go and live in the likes of Venezuela, I'm pretty sure you would then realise how horrible life really is.
This idea was rooted in the belief that progress, good societies only come out of ruthless competition between individuals. An idea popularized in the 19th century by mutton chops over here. But Hayek and Herbert Spencer, of course, weren't the only people thinking this way. Margaret Thatcher famously said, "There is no society. There are individual men and women, and there are families," which is how she sounded. If you'll go check it out, find a clip, Google it.
Yeah, the thing is though, is the fact that a lot of people misinterpreted Margaret Thatcher, and a lot of people even bent history and, lied about Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was right in what she says. There is no such thing as a society. And again, even it goes back to that argument on the welfare state, etc. There's nothing moral about trying to force society to collectively pay for other people. What capitalism's all about is basically voluntary action. And that's what Margaret Thatcher was more or less in support of. She was all about the charitable spirit. She was all about what Britain was of the 19th century, a country that would give through the community spirit. And that is actually what the welfare state destroyed. The welfare state destroyed that community spirit because people just took the attitude of thinking, why should I give when at the end of the day, the government will just do it for me? Yeah, that's essentially what happened.
But when we decide to ignore the deceptive rhetoric and just look at the facts, a much more complicated picture emerges. And in that picture, we can see capitalism being every bit as collectivist as communism or Nazism, and in some cases even more so.
No, it's not. Again, when you talk about individualism, you're talking about something that does have, the ability for people to work together collectively, but that's got nothing at all to do with what collectivism is. People just wrongly think that collectivism is just about people working together collectively. Okay, collectivism's not about that. Collectivism is really all about placing the collective and even the rights of the so-called collective over and above that of the individual. The individual rights, all property rights, etc., all individual rights are stripped away for you. So you've no got the right, you've no got, personal ownership of possessions, because after all, what do you require to own personal ownership possessions? Well, you require your individual private property rights. After all, if you had no private property rights, again, people can just steal and there's nothing you can do about it. Private property rights are there to clearly outline and define what you own. To say, I own this. If someone steals it, I have my rights here. I can take them to court and they can get done for it. That's the whole point of the private property rights. And of course, it creates a society that's harmonious. It gives people their individual rights and what have you, and that is not part of collectivism. Therefore, capitalism is not anything at all to do with collectivism. Capitalism is about individualism. Collectivism is where you subordinate all those individual rights. So you wouldn't own anything, really. It'd be all owned pretty much or controlled by the state. Pretty much what you saw of Nazism, or what you saw of fascism, or what you saw of, communism, etc. These regimes where the state would become the main element of the economy. It's anti-capitalist. This is as anti-capitalist as you could possibly get.
I understand this idea might be uncomfortable to some on the left who have come to rely on the heuristic that collectivism is good and socialist and individualism is bad and capitalist. And it will be equally uncomfortable to the libertarian who believes that collectivism is bad and socialist and individualism is good and capitalist. The truth is, collectivism and individualism can both be good and bad depending on the ways in which they're implemented, why they're implemented, and how they're enforced.
Did you actually just hear that? He says it can be good and just depending how it's enforced. Enforced. There's nothing good about something being enforced. End of story. You know, if you're having to go to that level of mental gymnastics of calling something coercive good, then you've just completely lost the plot. The bottom line is, there is nothing good about forcing things. Force is force. You're forcing other people against their will. There's nothing moral about it. That's where you've lost the argument. That's why capitalism is moral. It's why it pertains to human nature, because it accepts human nature being individualist, it accepts us being self-interested. Again, that doesn't mean people just, every man for himself, etc. However, the point being is the fact that capitalism is about voluntarism. And even then, if you were to talk from an economic perspective, well, good luck trying to justify things like the NHS, which has been a failure every single year in record. And even that argument to say, if it wasn't forced, people would be left without. That's just nonsense. We've seen enough myths relative to the Industrial Revolution. We've seen everything under the sun with all the myths about capitalism, even the myths about the robber barons, etc. We've heard it all, the usual nonsense, how there's a dangerous concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, etc., etc. We've heard it all.
One thing that Hayek was right about is that Nazism was collectivist. Fascism depends on forcing subjects of the state to subsume their will to that of the leader.
No, it doesn't depend with fascism. It is basically collectivist because it took away the individual's rights, so there was no individual rights at all. At the end of the day, you might like to believe that you owned private property, but you were to abide by everything the state dictated. In other words, material like that to do with the vampire economy, it would illustrate the very fact that you had no choice. You basically had to do what the state said, and if you didn't do what the state said, you would be punished for it. So fascism was inherently collectivist.
The leader, of course, is meant to represent the will of the collective. Citizens of authoritarian states, whether feudal monarchy, corporate capitalist republics, or fascist autocracy, are expected to sacrifice their labor, time, and lives to the will of the leaders.
Again, this whole term with corporate capitalism, you're basically talking about mercantilism, you're not talking about capitalism, and you're not talking about capitalism even when you talk about corporatism, end of story. You're basically talking about the economic element of fascism, and again, you're using socialism in order to create that. It's through the use of socialism creates that welfare for a special interest group, etc. It's essentially why you're living under corporatism today. It's through all the socialist government interventionism.
They must conform to the norms and laws of the regime. The existence of such collectivist authoritarian states undercuts the neat narrative that capitalism is individualist and communism is collectivist, given that Nazis and traditional fascists tend to be much more comfortable with capitalism than communism.
And now we see exactly the road he's going down. This is where he's trying to conflate capitalism with this today with corporatism, and they're not even remotely the same thing. Corporatism is anti-capitalist. It's anti-free market. It's against everything today with what capitalism stands for. He is basically trying to justify this corporatist system today. That's essentially what he's trying to say. Well, I would love to see how he justifies that, given the fact that you've seen crisis after crisis throughout the 20th century. We saw the failure as a result of all the control and manipulation of the interest rates that caused the boom and bust cycle. Where can you say that socialism's worked? Anywhere within a mixed economy. And this idea of this so-called corporate capitalism, which is really just him saying corporatism, which is anti-capitalist. But besides the point, where can he say that this system is justifiable? That's actually one thing I actually agree with Marxists upon. Marxists are absolutely spot on for saying that this system today doesn't work and it's not justifiable. He's trying to pass off this system today as something capitalist when it's not. This is not capitalism. This is anti-capitalism, It's anti-free market. So basically what you've got today, yes, you've got an element of capitalism, and capitalism to some extent, perhaps with the price fluctuation you see with regards to retail companies, but you wouldn't go as far as to say it's capitalism when they're bailing out failure, rewarding failure and punishing success. It's economic fascism.
Given that always their first targets are communists and socialists. This kind of collectivism is obviously bad. When a group does not tolerate dissent, enforces absolute conformity, and punishes people who diverge from the norm, that's a perverse form of collectivism, and it's undesirable. It sucks the diversity from life, and it takes away people's basic agency, their right to just live as they want to live and do what they want to do. Collectivism can, of course, be good, too, when it involves consenting members of a group who toil and sacrifice together, work in solidarity towards some better end for the common good.
Right, folk, and I think this is where, because his video obviously goes on long enough where it, goes on to a whole other half, and he's probably just going to mention the same stuff, etc. Just this last point, where he's trying to say it's something good, and then he mentioned about consenting individuals. Rang. Completely rang. Collectivism's got nothing at all to do with consent at all. There's no consent relative to that of collectivism. It's gone, right? You've got no consenting individuals, right? Your rights are all subordinated to that of the collective, and the state controls every aspect of your entire life. That's the reality of it. How's there the best of both worlds when there's no such thing as a mixed economy that is sustainable in the long term? Even from that perspective, from an economic perspective, it's unsustainable. It doesn't work. There's nothing there you can say there's consent relative to socialism. Everything with collectivism is based on coercion. And yes, you don't exactly live under full-blown collectivism or individualism today, but it's that element of individualism that's giving you the freedom to some extent, that enables you the freedom to go and do your own thing in terms of running your own private business or whatever, and that level of consent. In other words, it's down to individualism that gives you that. Collectivism doesn't. Once you're under full-blown collectivism, you can forget about consent. Consent is out the window. You abide by what the state says and what the state dictates. That's it. There is no consent. Even as simple as a mixed economy today, when it comes to the NHS, you can't even say it's a level of consent with regards to the whole thing of the healthcare. So anyway, folk, again, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Again, if you've got any questions, feel free to ask in the comment section below. And again, thank you for watching. Cheers.